great. We're going to have a bit of a changeover now, but I do really want to thank Minister Fraser and Jennifer Keesmaat for their continued work and a very thoughtful conversation around housing affordability. We talked about entitlements, conditional funding, an industrial strategy, blending, training, immigration targeting that is targeting certain building skills, and public land initiatives. So a very thoughtful discussion of a very complex and nuanced challenge. So as we set up the stage here, I do want to, again, I want to bring up that ULI also has an event coming up March 1st on the G in governance. And it is certainly an area that is very important when it comes to housing affordability, as a lot of decisions are made by boards, public or private, and a lot of the incentive and alignment of incentives comes from the governance discussion. So we eagerly are looking forward to that event, and we'll again, as ULI has generally a very multidisciplinary panel to give you multiple views and lenses to look at governance, how those decisions are made, how boards can keep people accountable for these types of outcomes. So we're going to shift to our panel discussion, and our panel's featuring the Global Mail's architect critic, Alex Bozikovic. I'll invite the panel to take their seats as we get set up in the interim. Please welcome our panel.
And thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you to colleague Dev Marquis for hosting us along with ULI. It is such a pleasure to be here with a really distinguished panel and to be sort of on the cusp of what I think is a rapidly evolving conversation, and a conversation that is evolving rapidly in a positive direction. As I was saying earlier to the mayor, as I was saying to the minister earlier, I've been writing about these issues, about planning reform and about the housing crisis for more than half a decade now, and no one was talking about these things in a holistic and comprehensive way, in the way that Minister Fraser did this morning, until very, very recently. So I think it's important to acknowledge how far we have come on this issue, or on these set of issues, but perhaps also how much farther we still have to go in certain respects. So with that, I'd like our panel to introduce themselves, if you don't mind. So starting with Chris, could each of you just tell us who you are and a little bit about the work that you're doing that is relevant to this sort of dual challenge that we're here talking about today, which is addressing the housing crisis and also the climate crisis. Chris.
Sure. Christopher Wein. I'm Chief Operating Officer of Lanterra Developments. I've been doing this for about 25 years. I've developed across Canada in many different provinces, as well as throughout the United States. And I'm also, in my past, have been involved in modular and panelization, which I'm a big believer in. I'm going to answer your question a little differently. What I would say is, based on the conversation we just heard about how can the federal government make changes that could help me as a builder-developer do a better job and deliver more housing. Number one, let's have a national building code. Let's not have provincial building codes. Why? We talk about 40 million people in this country, okay? We're not a big country. Geographically, we're not that different. The weather's the same all across the different municipalities. We have a ton of architects, a ton of consultants, and a ton of workers, construction workers, that can't move around freely from one province to another. They can't get recognized, so on and so forth. National building code, national green standards. Why are municipalities creating green standards? We're not going to solve climate change one city at a time. We're going to solve it as a country. So have a green standard that's the same for all municipalities, for building across the country. Allow professionals and construction workers to work in any province on a national building code, and allow us as developers to then be able to actually create factory housing, create panelization, and so on. I can invest in a panelization plant knowing that my panels only work in Toronto, and they don't work anywhere else in the country. But I can build cars in Oshawa and ship them all across the country. So we need to start behaving like a country and not like a series of individual stakeholders.
All right, so coming out with a bang here. Lucie, tell us about you and your work, please.
Good morning. I'm Lucie Andlauer. I'm the CEO of Subterra Renewables. Subterra is a fully integrated geo-exchange provider. Geothermal technology has been used all over the world, yet Canada has been very slow to adapt. I think the skill, the trade, the equipment, but more importantly, affordability. Subterra has been able to take that all on. We've become the largest fleet in North America for geo-drilling. We're still working at ways to increase the skill in our country, but it is the technology of the future. We work with developers like Christopher, let them concentrate on how they build from the ground up sustainable while we focus on what we do on the below the ground to give a reliable source for renewable energy. Thank you.
Thank you. Naama.
Yes, hi everyone, I'm Nima Bluhm. I'm an architect and urban planner. One of my projects actually made it to the news about 2 weeks ago, which is the Leon site at the 401 and Jane, which is a very interesting project because it was an employment conversion, which without the political will on the provincial level, that wouldn't have been possible. Beyond that, I walk around and try to convince people that density is the solution, that what we need. We still suffer from a severe cultural problem when it comes to density, the dependency on cars. You know, the minister mentioned that he has a 2-year-old, and I checked. Well, the minister is a millennial, just like me, and what very clearly worked for previous generations, my parents, it's clearly not working for this generation, and it's not a Toronto problem. Everywhere you talk to, it's the housing affordability is the crisis of our generation, which unfortunately we have more than one crisis to pick from. But it's a problem at a much greater level. So.
Thank you. So with that Leon's project, you are working on planning to build a bunch of housing together with keeping employment in the form of warehousing and retail on that side. Is that right?
Employment is part of it, yes. But if you talk about the definition of underutilized land, this is a 45-acre site that all it had or currently has is a single story. And it's not just the Leon, because the minister, the provincial, at the provincial level, when he signed the approval of converting land, it was more than 16 other properties that were sitting around. Some of them are better located, near transit, and they couldn't do anything. It was a major political issue from tax perspective, from saving employment opportunities. But we know that where there's will, there's a way. Like, we can keep the same amount of GFA, probably even deliver much more than what existing, especially when you're talking about that scale, and you include housing and many more other amenities, and then you get a story that is much, much better than keeping solely single-use land in a city like Toronto.
And of course, it'll be geo-exchange, correct?
Would make a lot of sense. So we can actually, this is an interesting direction to take. You talk about underused land, and implicit in what you're saying here is that there are a series of difficulties with city planning policy and with the interaction between provincial and city policy that make it hard to build. We're sitting here in Toronto, a city which has more than 200 square kilometers of residential land, which has fewer people than it did 40 years ago. And about the same size, larger in fact, of areas that are literally shrinking in population right now. It's about half of the city. So that, to me, and I don't think that's a fact that's widely understood, but it is true, and it's also true for Vancouver. So we have in the most high-demand, expensive, amenity-rich, job-rich places in the entire country, large expanses of land which is being underused. So feel free to jump in, anyone. What do we do about that, and what can the federal government do to encourage intensification in those areas?
I'll jump in first. I think intensification, unfortunately, because we're Toronto-based, we think of intensification as strictly vertical. So we look out these windows and we think of shiny glass towers and concrete construction. And one thing I would say is that if we're going to solve the housing supply issue, you're not going to do it with 5-year construction cycles, which is what it takes to build a tower. So what can we do? What we need to do is actually look at horizontal density. So it saddens me. I live in sort of Yorkville area, and I love to walk to Dufferin on the weekends along Bloor Street. And when I do that walk from basically Avenue Road to Dufferin, there's nothing but 2-story buildings, 3-story buildings, huge gaps, so on and so forth. What I always wonder, because my favorite city to spend time in is Paris, why can't there be a 6 to 8-story tall street wall, no side yard setbacks, no angular plane that just runs that entire length? If you filled in Bloor Street with 8-story wood frame, light gauge steel, or composite buildings, which can be built in 2 years, can be built through panelization, you would not only solve density, you would create a much healthier, sort of cleaner city. You'd have better streets, you'd have more walkability, and you'd have safety. I don't know if anyone's noticed I'm limping. I had a home invasion 3 weeks ago in the middle of the night. And the only reason I bring that up is we're thinking of going back to living in our 7-story condo from a single family house, because at least in the condo, we didn't have to worry about people breaking through the windows in the middle of the night. So safety is an issue in Toronto. Density, horizontal density, will help with the safety issue. So let's fill the Danforth with 8-story buildings, let's fill Bloor Street with 8-story buildings, and let's incentivize developers, both federally, provincially, and municipally, that if you can deliver housing from pulling the permit to occupancy in 2 years through mid-rise construction, there should be an incentive for that. Give some kind of tax break or so on, because these 5 and 6 year construction cycles aren't good for anybody.
Naama, do you want to offer a counterpoint to that specific take?
Well, actually, yes, because right now the city is working on its major streets, which is not on the Danforth and Bloor, but to get the yellow belt, the neighborhoods designated properties, to build as of right 6 stories up to 30 units. Unfortunately, you will still need to have a site plan, but also the irony that in Toronto, after so long that the neighborhoods were, locked from anything, you would still have the commercial streets, which Jennifer, I believe you wanted to make mid-rise as of right, and we don't have it. So it's almost like the irony.
The key, though, is no side yards, no setbacks, straight up, and no angular plane. So, because you can't have a 6-story building and then 50 feet and another 6-story building and 50 feet. You need a consistent street wall.
These are design guidelines, but you know how much, and I work closely with the city's team on that. You know how much opposition they are getting from single-family homeowners to, God forbid, put a 6-story in front of them. So to answer your question, what I think we need is to make the density approvals way less political and way more professional. I think that we maybe should have less community engagement and more design review panel, or C of A should not be by a member of that I need to explain to, a retired teacher or a dentist that building a 6-story at St. Clair is actually considered minor because the height variance is 0.85 centimeters. I need to explain that perhaps to staff, so staff could approve what is considered minor variance. So I know the mayor, unfortunately, is not here, but you asked about the federal. So provincial and federal needs to take the power of, because again, we still get all of this approved by NIMBYs and Councillor Bradford is here, but how many of those positive voices we have in council? Not too many. We're still making decisions by the most vocal voices and in the room, and 1%, listening to the 1% is not democracy. So the more we can get approved with less political, more professional decision making, and if the federal government needs to make that decision or the provincial government, so be it.
Yeah, and to jump on what you're saying, the other thing too is we're engaging the community for design decisions, which they're not qualified. Right. They're not necessarily architects or planners. Right. So community consultation, I'm a big believer in, but it should be about compatible uses. It should be about, could be density, but also, what's happening at grade, what's happening with retail, what's happening with community space, what's happening with schools, so on and so forth. It shouldn't be around building design, building heights, building form, so on and so forth, and that's the problem. Is community consultation has gone from what's proper, which is what is being introduced as a use, into, no, now I'm like junior architect, and I'm going to start, because I'm in the community and on the community association, I'm going to start picking apart bricks and design and windows and glazing and setbacks.
Okay, so to step back a little bit, what the two of you are very passionately speaking about here is essentially an idea of approaching city planning differently, doing planning in a comprehensive and proactive way, saying, this is where growth is going to happen and here's what it's going to look like, and that is real. That planning is real, as opposed to what actually happens in Toronto, where the zoning, as everyone knows, is entirely bogus and nothing gets constructed without negotiation. And that's also true in almost every city across the country, including those that have the biggest shortages of housing. So, it would be a different model, and what I hear perhaps is that the federal government might help by using the bully pulpit to talk about the importance of density and the importance of intensification, particularly in our biggest cities. Does that sound right?
That's somewhat fair, and I do think, back to my opening remark, the National Green Standard, National Building Code would help a lot, because then we all are building the same thing to the same standard. So I think the federal government has huge power to allow for that. And that needs to happen.
Excellent. Lucie, if we're going to build more densely in our cities, we heard a little bit earlier from Jennifer about the idea that intensification has direct climate benefits in the sense that people are not traveling as much, they're not driving as much, they're not taking as much space. But can you talk to us also about geothermal and about the relationship between geothermal technology and this sort of new denser city that we are imagining here? How would that work, and what are the benefits?
It works so well for geothermal because, again, we're working with what's underneath the ground. So no matter how big the building is, we can still do our work underneath. Buildings, I'm sure as many of you know, are one of the largest contributors of greenhouse emissions. So we need to make sure that all these new buildings do not affect the climate and do it together, so we build a very sustainable future.
And this system is commercially viable these days, right? I mean, it is 100%. Happening.
Absolutely. We have our offering is a design-build model where we own, operate, design, build the model. So in that case, we can actually make it very affordable for the end user by lowering the payments. Most of the times, it's 10% cheaper than traditional HVAC, and the product lasts probably longer than the building. This can last 50 to 100 years.
Right, and so thinking about that technology or other analogous changes in building envelopes or other building systems that would contribute to better building performance, how can the federal government make those more attractive? How can the federal government help the country scale up on your tech and others that would be useful in this way?
They've started, but, with the tax incentives is one part that starts. It's still not enough, I don't think. I think demanding that people must build green and must look at geo-exchange as a viable option is probably the best way to do it.
I also think district energy is incredibly important, and I think the federal government has the ability to incentivize municipalities to go to a district energy model, and it's widely used throughout Europe. It's far better than what we have here. So this idea that every building I build, I'm basically building my own little power plant to heat and cool the building, which is insane, and we're building one next door to another one, another one, another one. That should all be district energy.
And is that a system, I know that it does exist commercially, what would it take to have that, likewise, to have that sort of tech scaled up and used more broadly?
I think one of the issues is that when you have that scale, very expensive, a very long process, and in the way the buildings are owned today, when you have condo boards or HOAs and everything, there's so much encumbrance on how they communicate and how they share, but it's definitely the future, especially when you have multiple types of buildings. It's so important.
And to Jennifer's point way back, this morning, have the federal government and the provincial government invest in inner city core district energy infrastructure, not urban sprawl. So quit building highways to nowhere, quit, creating communities north of Stouffville, put the money in the city where the city needs it and where the density is.
I think everyone would agree with that here. But, and an interesting point, if we look behind the stage here, the city is growing vertically, but we are very much in the center of the city, and there are zones within 400 meters of where we're sitting that are still today zoned for a maximum of 3-story buildings, and apartments are effectively impossible. And many of those areas, a 5 or 10 minute walk from here, are also shrinking in population, right? So I guess I repeat this because it seems to me that with this goal, or these very ambitious goals, to cut our national emissions in half, and to build in rapid succession 5.8 million new homes, we're going to be seeing dramatic physical change, at least in some places. And that's something we are not used to. over the last 40 years, we have not seen a lot of physical change. So could each of you talk to me, please, about what you imagine that looking like? Let's set the scene for what, in our biggest, say, 5 or 6 cities, 2 generations from now, what those might look like and what some of the benefits of that change would be.
I really appreciate this question because I keep saying to people, you think now it's unaffordable? Can you imagine this city 25 years from now if we're not making some radical changes? What choices our kids will have? And I don't know, there's a wonderful book. It's a business book, not like a professional book. It's called Blue Ocean. I don't know how many of you have read it. It's a wonderful book. It basically, on the first chapter, it says, think about what will seem in 20 years from now will be taken for granted, but it's not yet existing, and that's your key for success in business. And for me, it's, for family, and sounds, and you probably picked from my accent, I wasn't born and raised in Canada, and for more than 50% of Torontonians, what I'm about to say is almost sounds ridiculous, but for families to live in apartments in mid-rise and tall buildings. And it's a North American conception that it's a cultural thing that it's really hard for people to digest. But I got a story in Toronto Life. It's called My Parks Are Nicer Than Your Backyards. When I told my friends back home that I got featured in the news because I raised my kids in an apartment and I don't own a car, they were like, what?
Why is this news?
What? So it's that concept that we don't have now. But let me ask you, if we're not going to live in mid-rise and denser communities, and just tying into sustainability, which you are by far more expert than I would ever be, but we keep saying, okay, the government will solve it with taxes or whatnot, and G7 and whatnot, but one thing that we could do, and I hope to see in future generations, is that really decreasing the dependency on cars. It's something that I really hope people will, I was talking at TMU last week. I told them I hope that ditching a car once you own it is really hard. I hope you will never buy it. So.
And decreasing, not eliminating, but decreasing the role of the car.
Cars are not, I always say, I wish cars are not like shoes. You don't have to use it every time you leave your home. Maybe like snow boots, where it's snowing out there, you need to use it. But it's possible.
Yeah,
Lucie?
I totally agree with you. I think that the European market around the world, owning a home, a single-family home, is not the goal for everyone. So we all know we need that. I do have to say, though, I do worry about the support systems around this density, the hospitals, the schools, and what we're going to do in the communities to ensure we have that protection and make sure that we're not allowing these people to be on the streets and getting the care that they need. So that's the concern that I have with it, but I think we have to work together to make sure that they have the housing and the support that we need.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I think, we all hear about the elusive 15-minute city. I think that is truly what I would love to see 10 years from now. I'm going to say against what I do. I don't know if we need more 50-story towers. I'm not sure that's the future of life in Toronto. I really am a big proponent of mid-rise. Mid-rise doesn't work because of zoning, taxes, affordability, so on, around construction, density, et cetera. Those are financial considerations that can be solved. We need to solve them. If we don't solve being able to build 6 to 10-story mid-rises that are affordable and actually the developer can turn a profit, that's a huge issue. I think the other thing is everybody affords the dignity to have a home that they can live in. Not everybody in our society, and I hate to say this, but you look at Europe and you look at Asia, not everyone's going to be able to afford a home ownership. So what we need to do is make sure everybody lives in a home that suits their needs, suits their family, and works for them. We need to focus more on workforce housing. I'm very tired of the affordable housing conversation, because every time we talk about affordable housing, we hear how we're going to build 300 units. That I love it. It's wonderful because we do need to get people off the streets. But we have teachers and nurses and custodians and so on that cannot afford to live in our city. That is insane. That's workforce housing. People who have a good job, who they need a place to live, they need to be able to afford to raise their families. Workforce housing is what we really should be focused on, because that we need tens of thousands of units. It's not just getting people off the streets. It's getting people that they don't have to commute 2 hours because they can't afford being a nurse in downtown Toronto. They have to live in 2 hours away. It's ridiculous.
So where does that go in Toronto or in Vancouver?
What's that?
Where does that go geographically in Toronto or in Vancouver?
Right here. Like, look outside. And one of the challenges we have to do, and I hate to go slightly sideways on a topic, but if we make 8-story buildings as of right everywhere, land arbitration is gone, because this idea that, like, we do an arbitrage on land in Toronto, and it's ridiculous. So Jennifer's a developer now. She thinks she can build a 50-story tower. She's going to pay $100 million. I think I can build a 75-story building. I'm going to pay $125 million. Someone thinks they're going to do 90 stories. They're going to pay $200 million. Land is out of control because we have no rules around it. So it's like you said, it's a negotiation. It's insane. We need to fix it so that, like in other jurisdictions like the US, we all pay the same price. And then if I'm a better developer than Jennifer, it's because maybe I'm a better builder, or maybe I have a better brand, or I can charge a little more. It's not because I negotiated a land deal in a back room somewhere. It's crazy.
Well, this is perhaps another question about regulation and conversations between governments. I'm just going to spell something out which I think will be clear to almost everyone in the room, but is not to people outside of the room. What is happening in Toronto, and analogously what is more or less what is happening in Vancouver, is that you have provincial policy which properly insists on intensification and insists on the value of intensification in line with protecting the green belt and preventing sprawl. But then you have a local government that fundamentally is not accepting that and continues to have policies in place that does not allow density to happen. And so the role of the infamous Ontario Municipal Board or Land Tribunal is to overrule the city to allow those provincial policies to take effect. So is that correct? And if so, what do our leaders do to remedy that very complicated, politically difficult situation that we are in?
So, I would say that the OLT is a symptom of the disease. I think that the OLT has to exist because our system is broken. Our system's broken both municipally and provincially, and the feds need to take some responsibility for this too. So how do you fix that? I think at the end of the day, it comes back to the idea that the more that you can, and I think Minister Fraser said it, template these things so that we understand that we all can build the same thing. We all have the same rights to build a certain scale anywhere we are in the country, and we're going to build to the same standard with respect to design standards, green standards, code standards. I think if we do that, we sort of can take all this negotiation out of the mix. Because I think the problem with negotiation, including the city, is negotiation is strife with, sort of financial incentives, and I hate to say it that way, and there's always going to be kind of a lack of transparency. So I think take the negotiation out of the system, and everything will start to clean itself up.
So everyone needs to be on the same page about what the future looks like, which is a city in which 8-story buildings are everywhere. Is that fair?
Everywhere, including, look down here. There's tons of sites. There's a ton of sites right now I'm looking at that are 6 stories, 5 stories, 4 stories. Fill in those gaps.
All right, no problem. Let's get it done. It does seem interesting, though, that the political case for this is so difficult. And many of the issues that Canada and Canada's big cities are facing are analogous to those in other wealthy countries, particularly in the US, which has a similar planning history and a similar history of development to ours. But one thing that's different here is that we've actually done this before. And I find this strange in the housing policy discussion that people will still talk about apartments as if they don't belong, when the fact is that 1 million people in this region live in apartments that were constructed 40, 50, 60 years ago. I grew up in this region, and both of my grandparents, who came from very different walks of life, ended up in high-rise towers. So this is quite literally part of life here. So it seems strange that we have somehow managed to forget all of that in the last 30 years.
No, but you know what, I find it a little bit that they have their own land use color and definition, and it's called apartment neighborhoods, as if people who live in apartments are different from the people who live in the low-rise neighborhoods, and they are different, right? And what you said about, your point about scarcity of land, that's because mixed use and apartment neighborhoods, as much as I don't like using that word, combined are less than 8.5% of the city as a whole. And we have, I published on LinkedIn, or posted, an overlay of the yellow belt with transit. Why are we even treating it differently? Everything that is near transit needs to be high density, period. Everything else, you want those, which I have really a hard time with calling it, those stable and protected and all of these words, fine, let them be. But anything, transit is not different if it's in a commercial street or if it's near transit, it needs to be high density, full stop.
So what you're saying is we need transit-oriented development for the subways that were built 60 years ago.
It's no different, yes, exactly.
Which is politically tricky, but maybe we'll get there. Interestingly, all of these local planning things come around, and the City of Toronto is reviewing the first chapter of its official plan right now. So if anyone at the city is interested in revisiting some of these first principles, the window happens to be open as we speak. How do we build? I want to move this a little bit to talking about design, which is a tricky and broader and softer question. Obviously, much more subjective. But what are the design decisions, either at a small scale or a larger scale, that we can make to make this new 8-story urbanism more attractive to people and better to live in? What are we not doing right that we could fix, and what should we be envisioning in terms of architecture and landscape architecture to make this denser city more attractive? Any ideas?
I already proposed one thing, which is less community engagement, more design review panel with let's say the design review panel cannot use the words height and density, so they could really focus on design.
So professional review, peer
Professional review. This is one, and B is to really understand, when I talk to developers about family-friendly condos or units, and don't get me wrong, it's not just about size. You'll come to my condo, you won't say, wow, this is big. It's not. It's a 3-bedroom, very compact, but it's great. And when I talk to developers, they say, no one will buy. Couples cannot imagine themselves buying anything pre-construction. And usually I say, there are companies out there, just think about Uber or Airbnb, convincing their market, right? Like Uber getting in a car with a stranger, or Airbnb, open your home to a stranger. There are companies out there who've done a much more drastic transition with their market than convincing young couples that they, in 5 years they will have 2 kids or whatever they will have. So, and that demographics exist. They are just pushed to buy somewhere very far away from the city because the alternative does not exist right now in the city. And when I was looking for a 3-bedroom condo, by the way, I was looking for a 4-bedroom that does not exist.
Doesn't exist, right.
And we were looking for a 3-bedroom, and we're both architects, me and my partner, and it should have been easy. We know where to look, let's put it that way. And he came home and he said, I narrow it down. There are 2 buildings in the city where we, checks our boxes. So it shouldn't be like that. We should have more increasing supply, and increasing supply that reflects the needs of our growing communities. And the market will be there. The private sector will find its way to deliver that.
So just a couple things. What I would say is let's talk a little bit of math. So 50% of the cost of a new home is construction, which is actually not that high a number, but it's approximately 50%. Okay, and then there's 15 to 20%, which is land, which land is an issue. We're going to get to that in a moment. And then the other 30% is a combination of finance and taxes. So how do we fix this? Is it really that it's that expensive to build stuff? It isn't. And it isn't, especially if we could fast track approvals and have more standards at a national level. So how does cars do it? So think about it. $50,000 car that I bought 15 years ago compared to the same $50,000 car that I can buy today is a piece of junk. Today's car is incredible, but it hasn't got more expensive. They just keep making them better and better and better. Why is that? Because they don't have the same taxation, they have different ways of financing, and they don't have this idea that land, is ridiculously fluctuating in value and price. So I think that we can actually build proper units, because I do agree you can't raise a family in 550 square feet. So if we could standardize and fix, we need to have banking reform. We need to allow people to have longer amortization. We need to change debt servicing ratios. Young people don't own cars, so don't include that in the debt service ratio. We need to allow young people not to pay tax, HST or GST, on a new home purchase, their first purchase. We need to make sure the cities don't development charge the hell out of young Canadians. There's a lot of those things that can be fixed, and then you would see, like, I want to build 2 and 3 bedroom units that people can live in. I have a 3-bedroom condo that I love that's on Davenport in a 7-story building. It's beautiful, but I'm a successful guy, so I can afford it. It's sad that a teacher can't afford that. They should be able to. But you're not going to fix it. It's not the construction that's the issue. It's those other factors that we need reform in.
Well, actually, I want to catch you there because I have often heard that construction is the issue. And certainly, construction capacity is an issue. I mean, Minister Fraser said that earlier, and it is certainly, without question, a real issue. But Jennifer and I were discussing this privately. The way in which we build growth now is largely in concrete. And it seems as though perhaps the tightest point of the construction supply chain is right there. So what if we were to build more using lower skilled trades? What if we were to build stick-build housing at a large scale, which can go up to, what, 5 stories under code now? 6. So is that plausible commercially and technically to do a lot of that? And if so, why is it not already happening?
So one of the biggest challenges is the cost of land. So the challenge is I look at a site I got a site right now in Eglinton, near transit, and it would be a perfect 8-story. First of all, we should do 8-story wood. We only do 6 right now, but they do 8 out west.
In the new National Building Code, we'll
yes,
put that
exactly,
in there.
exactly. But the land value, everybody's valuing it that it's going to be a 30-story tower. So I can't pay for 30 stories of density and then build 8. So that is a huge issue. But to your point about constructability, we should, like what the automobile industry's done, is go to composite buildings. So we need to use all materials. And this is, again, where a national code and national green standard would help. So there should be heavy timber. There should be wood. There should be light gauge steel. There should be, at times, concrete. It shouldn't be one size fits all. You should look at what are the best materials. Like now, we have carbon fiber rebar. It's expensive because it's not in very high use yet in Canada. But imagine delivering rebar that weighs 1/25 of what a rebar weighs because it's made of carbon fiber.
And
So
what would be the advantage of that? Spell that out for us.
What's that?
And what's the advantage of that? Spell that out
Well,
for us.
first of all, delivery, I could deliver far more. You see these giant flatbeds moving through the center of the city, causing tons of traffic issues, and you look at it and think, there's nothing on there. There's like 3 tons of rebar. Well, because rebar is heavy as hell, so 3 tons takes up very little space, but is really hard to deliver. Giant cranes, it's slow, it's dirty, it takes a lot of men to tie it, or men and women.
And is very carbon
fiber
intensive,
would
right?
be completely, yes.
Right, and steel rebar is carbon intensive in its fabrication, in its
Everything.
transportation, and its construction all the way through. Right. A slightly related issue, or let's take it a little bit sideways, back into architecture. There has been a lot of talk, thankfully, about the idea of single stair egress in apartments. This sounds like an extraordinarily boring thing, but it is, in fact, transformative for apartment buildings. You're nodding eagerly. Okay, so Naama, do you want to tell everybody what that is and what it means and why we should change regulations to make it happen?
Yeah, I'll translate it to words you understand. The efficiency of the building decreases substantially in the lower scale because imagine you need the same space for elevation, circulation, and the 2 staircase. And the smaller the building is, the efficiency gets much, much lower. So if in a mid-rise building you see 83%, 85%, in a tower you see 90% efficiency, in the missing middle, excuse me, it automatically decreases to 75. I've seen as low as 68% efficiency. That is because you need the same amount of means of egress regardless of the size of the building. The rationale behind it is that every unit, in a case of a fire, you open the door and either way you're running towards you will get a way out. So that's the rationale. But there are some really smart and passionate people in the industry trying to change that. And I think they are making some really
progress.
drastic. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
The other controversial thing, why are we sprinkling fully non-combustible 50-story towers? You know, it costs now, I just did 2 more tenders just in the last week. It's now $10,000 a unit to put sprinkler systems into a 500 square foot unit. And then the other great thing is, that's where all the insurance costs come, because almost everybody who is a high-rise builder in this room, put up your hand if you haven't had a sprinkler flood during construction, because I've had one on almost every single building, and the costs are millions of dollars. You have a sprinkler head blow on the 40th floor in the middle of construction, water goes down. Right. So now, like it literally can cost, we've had floods that are $10, $15 million floods. Why are we doing this? Like, when was the last time you saw a modern, high-rise, non-combustible building catch fire?
Right, so what you're asking for here is a careful review of relevant building regulations and planning regulations to figure out where we are perhaps imposing costs on projects which are actually unnecessary and don't generate a social benefit. Is that fair?
That's fair.
All right, so federal government has some work to do then. So let's talk a little bit about building multifamily housing, specifically in cities, again. And talk to me about how, just essentially walk us through how, now that we're in our city of the future with 8-story buildings across the city, walk us through how geothermal works and what it does for people's quality of life.
So I think when we talked about district energy, if you've got multiple 8-story buildings, it's best to kind of put the geothermal holes can go about 850 feet into the ground. So we could service multiple buildings by doing that. And I think the air quality is better. Let's face it, 70% of our carbon comes from buildings. So the less we have to build up and the more we use green energy, the better all the buildings are and the quality of life for people living in them.
Excellent. So you're improving air quality. How? Explain, please.
Sorry about that?
How are we improving air quality? Spell that out for us.
Obviously, for the less carbon in the air, they're saying the air quality is better to breathe. So all of it basically is protecting. We talk a lot about cars and getting cars off the road, yet buildings are one of the biggest contributors to this. So if we can build green, we solve that issue. And we can do it because it's right under the ground. We're not asking people to change anything. We're not in your critical path. We're just asking you to use what's beneath you to help heat and cool your buildings.
And you can incentivize developers to work together, the same way we build subdivisions. So when I was a subdivision home builder, we didn't build the subdivision by ourselves. Most home builders, they usually are partnering with 3 or 4 different companies. So you'll get like an Aspen Ridge and a Great Gulf partnering, or an Arista and a Great Gulf, and so on. So same thing, cities, both municipalities, provinces, and the feds could say, listen, in this area, you know, this 10 square miles, we insist that if you're going to get your planning approvals, you guys have to collectively use a private district energy solution. So district energy doesn't have to be owned by the municipality. It could be done privately.
Yes, we do many.
But again, do it as a collaboration. Don't, instead of me doing one-offs, force us in a radius to have a field.
And you're seeing that with the builders. You see in Oakville where we're doing the Aspen Ridge or the Brand Havens, or everybody is working together on the systems. It works amazing.
All right, so collective high-level planning. Let's talk about public land, and we're moving towards the end here, but public land, I think, is a crucial issue, and another thing that came up in Jennifer and Minister Fraser's conversation. Metrolinx, Ontario's transit agency, owns more than 900 acres of land in immediate proximity to its transit stations. 900 acres. Other government agencies could tell similar stories. But certainly there is an opportunity there, and an opportunity which our country, with the partial exception of Metro Vancouver, has not really taken advantage of, building around transit on public land. So where particularly do you guys see the opportunities, and how might we, make that happen? How do we put that land to use?
I think leased air rights. I think, to Jennifer's point, there is a challenge because there is a public trust that we can't just sell these lands to private developers that then we never see again. But if you can do 100-year leases, and you give me an air rights lease. So I don't need it at grade. You've got your transit station at grade. You've got your library at grade. You've got your public school at grade. And it's funny because I used to say this all the time about education. Like, why is the public school system in the real estate business? They should be in the education business. They don't need to own real estate. They don't need to manage real estate. We should be building schools within existing developments. All this retail that's now suffering, put schools in that. Like, if you look at New York, there's schools in many of the buildings. They don't have standalone, I own this real estate, I maintain this real estate. No, just teach our children. That's what you should be good at, not real estate.
The funny thing is, yes, agreed. Funny thing is that in Toronto, there was a lot of happy PR being made around the announcement of a new school being constructed as part of a new high-rise, which is not far from here at 1 Yonge Street. But in fact, that's not even new. In the St. Lawrence neighborhood, a block from where we are, there were buildings constructed in the late 1970s that have 2 schools integrated into apartment buildings. So that's something that not only this country has done, but this city and the very same public school boards who now 50 years later are having, are very proud of themselves for having essentially reinvented the wheel. So I'm sorry, I don't mean to be snarky, but we don't necessarily need to look abroad for inspiration, right? I mean, sometimes we have actually done some things here that are actually quite smart.
Well, I agree with you. Like, lessons from the past are something that we should look at. We shouldn't always be saying that every idea has to be a new, brilliant idea. History can teach us a lot, and I think, during the baby boom, post-war housing in the 1950s, 1960s, all levels of government built a ton of housing. Now, it was the wrong form of housing. It was good back then because it was single-family housing. Now we need them to figure out how to build apartment housing. But they have done it. In the 1950s, they did a ton of it all across the country. You look at Calgary, half of downtown Calgary is all these little post-war homes that were built in the after World War II.
With considerable support and effectively subsidy from the federal government. Right?
100%.
Right. It's an interesting point that the federal government was not. We often hear talk about the role of social housing, which certainly needs to grow. But an interesting fact that I've learned in my reporting is that there's never been a point in Canadian history when more than 5% of people were in social housing. So, not to suggest that it isn't necessary, but the good old days that we're looking back to in terms of affordability were a period in which almost everybody was still living in market housing, and affordability was much better than it is now. So that is. How dramatically do we need to shift? Let me put this to you as a question. Does that 5% need to turn into 10? Does it need to turn into 20, given the economic and demographic factors that we're dealing with now? How much more public housing of one form or another, or non-market housing, does this country need? What do you think? Naama, come on.
Annabelle Alow said to her community in one of our open houses, she said, affordability is a spectrum.
That's right.
We need, right? So right now, that spectrum, we just need more of everything. So it probably doesn't answer your question. But when I talk to the public, that's an idea that I'm trying to lead with. We need to build more, and also I'm keep asking myself if new could ever be affordable. When I moved to this country, my first apartment was, one from the 60s. Even the condo that I bought, I didn't buy new. So, can new ever be affordable? Or what we need is just building more, increasing supply, and then there will be shift, and then other, socioeconomic levels will enjoy more housing options.
Right, which is the normal pattern, right? In a situation where housing is not super scarce, that new housing is the most expensive, and over time, it generally becomes less expensive, right? And because we have a great scarcity of housing, in some cases, we're now seeing the opposite. Correct? Yeah. All right.
Well, think of, going back to my car analogy, cars really have not got more expensive. In the last 25 years, cars have gotten better, but the average price of a car has stayed consistent for 25 years. There's really been no inflation.
Right,
Yet housing has, in Toronto, a house 25 years ago was worth 1/15 of what it's worth today. So the inflationary pressures on housing have created the fact that we now don't have workforce housing. And again, I prefer that term because that's really where the pinch is being felt. It's that the average worker cannot afford a home to raise their family. And that is crazy in a country as rich as Canada. And it's also a regional thing. So Toronto, Vancouver is where we're really feeling the pressure. Like, let's not forget, like in Halifax, there's not so much pressure. PEI, not so much pressure. It's coming.
It is.
You know, Saskatchewan a little bit, but not so much. So that's the other thing, is we need to figure out how, and maybe it's the future of work, it's part of it. How can we allow people to live dignified lives and not be forced that 25% of the Canadian population has to live in the GTA? Because that's part of the problem. 1 in 4 Canadians live in the GTA for all
Because it's an
intents and
awesome
purposes.
place, and people who are moving to Canada want to stay here in Toronto and not to
Yeah,
move
but-
anywhere else.
Yes and no,
Let's
but
solve how we
but-
house them here, and not how we tell them, hey, listen, you're late. We were here first,
This is
but
not for
this
you.
place is awesome. Go
No.
in.
Here's the thing. We need to make sure that all across Canada, people enjoy a great quality of life and that there's economic opportunity. People live in Toronto for the economic opportunity more so than they live in Toronto because it's the greatest city. It's not the greatest lifestyle. I've lived across the country in 5 different provinces. This is the place that you make good money and there's good economic opportunity. It's not the safest place. It's not the cleanest place. We're having a lot of problems these days. So
Can argue about that.
it's okay. Now, the other thing I'll say is, let's look at our neighbors to the south. If the U.S. was similar, New York City would have a population of 100 million. But it doesn't. It has a population of 18 million, because in the States, their population is spread all across. There's great cities. We always forget, like, we think that Toronto is the be-all and end-all because we're here in Toronto. It is not the be-all and end-all. Canada's a great country. We should really figure out federally how we can make sure that there's economic opportunity for Canadians coast to coast, and not force them that they must live in the power centers of Toronto, Vancouver, or Montreal.
Well, look, I mean, that's a controversial take, but important to recognize, I think, that when we talk about the American context, New York City is building effectively no housing. So this region, the Toronto region, is, despite all of the problems that we are facing, which are real, is in a North American context still building quite a lot of housing. The question is whether it is enough and how we get to these much larger, very ambitious numbers, which we are now being asked to meet. So, guys, I think we're coming towards the end of our time here. So if you have any sort of final words, perhaps, we've envisioned this great new future of, 8-story buildings running on geothermal, mixed-use buildings, combining industry and retail and residential. People can avoid getting into their cars if they even own one. This is the future we're moving towards. So any final words of advice for Minister Fraser, perhaps, about how we get there? How do we achieve this new, more urbanist Canada of the future?
I have one point that I wasn't able to make till just now, and that is we do have a capacity issue. And what I mean by capacity is capacity of skilled workers to build all this. And the answer that, well, we'll figure it out next generation is not the right answer. Because that's not going to solve anything, and the problem's just going to get worse. So how can we solve this? Temporary foreign worker visas allow temporary workers to come into the country to build. When I was building in Calgary, we did it. We brought up 300 Mexican framers. They were incredible. They worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. They were thrilled. They made lots of money. We built tons of housing. The only challenge with it is when the government changed, provincial government, they ended the program. Right. And it was like, why are you ending this program? This is a fantastic program. It was a win-win-win. So the federal government needs to figure out how to get skilled workers into the country now, not next generation.
All right.
I'd like to think, too, that the education system, we're not getting enough of our Canadians doing these jobs. It's a crazy thing. We can bring them in, and I totally agree with you. You have to. But I'm amazed, I think, when I was in school, they talked about trades more. They talked about people. I mean, not everybody wants to be necessarily like us and be in an office or work for a bank. And you can make great money in trades and have a great life. More importantly, you can go home at 5 o'clock and not think about another thing that you have to stress about. Your job is there and done, but for some reason this conversation is just not happening. So we can bring in from other countries, but why are we not starting earlier and educating children that you don't have to work in a bank, you don't have to be a broker. Drilling, geothermal drilling, if anyone needs a job, pays really, really well. Really well, and I'd love to get more Canadians looking at doing them. Western Canada has done a great job of doing it, but I would like to see more, but I'm open to immigration too. I love it. Yeah.
I agree with you 100%. One of the challenges is If I get my business degree at UBC, I can get a job in Toronto at TD Bank. If I am actually a skilled trade that has my ticket in BC, I can't necessarily take that ticket and run to Ontario and I got to start over again. I got to, re-apprentice, so on and so forth. It's insane. So we need to do what Germany's done. Germany's actually one of the best countries where I think 48% of their workforce goes into skilled trades, 52% goes into knowledge worker, and there's no difference. There's nobody that says, oh, your poor kids, they went to be electricians. Too bad, I guess they weren't that bright. It's considered consistent with being a banker or a knowledge worker or an accountant or a doctor. We need to do the same thing, but we're only 40 million people. We can't do it unless it's federal, because you can't expect someone in PEI that's a journeyman trade that's 45 years old to now have to move to another part of the country and start over again. That's crazy.
All right, so we need to build a culture that emphasizes the value of, quite literally, of building, of helping this country build for the future. Naama, any final words before we wrap up? No, you're good. All right, everybody, please join me in thanking our panel.
Really want to thank our panel. You can see everyone's very passionate about this issue. And I think a lot of that passion comes from, as the minister talked about, as this challenge goes less from being theoretical or statistical or academic to impacting very personal family members and that 1 degree of separation between us and the housing affordability challenge. While this crisis may have been decades in the making, all of us in the room now must know it takes decades to fix. For our part, at ULI Toronto, we will be vigilant in our focus on this crisis and the ideas and the innovations, many innovations as we've discussed today, and the industry leadership at all levels of government, private and not-for-profit sectors, and how we're going to drive to solve it. So on behalf of ULI, again, I thank everyone for attending today. I thank our panelists, our speakers, our officials for putting this together. And please look forward to future ULI events. We have lots of them coming up. Take care.